Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon, and welcome to Optimum Sports Consulting's first ever webinar discussing takeaways 4 months into NIL. This two-part webinar will begin with Oliver Luck, former college athletic director and NCAA executive and current advisor at Altius Sports, sitting down with Optimum Sports Consulting's partner, Eric Galko. At about 1 p.m., part 2 will feature MOGL's Director of Compliance, Khalil Wilkes, Excel Sports Manager NIL Director, Arun Thatakara, and OSC partner Austin Mayo, and will be moderated by Optimum Sports Consulting's Emily Rollo. This webinar will be recorded, and we are intending to upload it to the website shortly. We ask that all viewers' cameras and microphones remain off for the entirety of this webinar, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. So without further ado, Oliver and Eric, you guys can take it away.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Excited to see some of the people in here as well, too. I know a lot of people will join and listen in recording. Excited to talk to Oliver Luck today. Oliver's someone I've known for a long time now, and certainly someone I've asked a lot of questions about in this ever-shaping NIL landscape. And Oliver, appreciate you joining. I'll kind of get right into it. I'd love to kind of get your take. The biggest question we've gotten so far is football was kind of the first sport through the gate when it comes to NIL, but college basketball is coming up, and certainly football can learn next year what NIL happened this year in the sport. What do you think that basketball, non-football athletes and non kind of NIL breakthrough people can kind of learn so far in the short time that NIL has existed?
Well, first of all, hello, Eric, and greetings to everybody who is logged on to the webinar. So, football, number one, is obviously first in line as the preeminent fall sport. And secondly, it's obviously the most popular sport in this country. So no surprise that football has garnered a bunch of the headlines in terms of NIL. It's difficult to say how deep it's going in football because nobody's really tracking the data, right? Across the country, we have all sorts of anecdotal stories about what this player or that player or the offensive line at this school or that school might be doing. But because nobody's tracking the data, it's very difficult to really get a complete picture of what's going on. Surprisingly, though, even during the fall, right, during these first 4 months, during the first semester, if you will, of NIL, we're seeing a number of Olympic sport athletes really do some significant deals. And these are all individuals, students, men and women with, I think, a unique skill set, like the Cavender twins out in, at Fresno State, who've done remarkably well. So clearly, NIL is something that's available to everybody. It's probably a little bit too early to draw any real lessons from football because, this market is just, young, it's embryonic, it's very nascent. It just hasn't really had much time to develop. I think one thing that we're beginning to see as I talk to athletic directors and others is that the vast majority of the dollars are coming from the local marketplace of that particular school. So, if you're a West Virginia University athlete, your NIL opportunities by and large are going to come from, maybe 50, 100 miles of your school, where the brand, the West Virginia brand is important, or perhaps from donors who may be in other parts of the country, but still have a strong emotional connection to the school. So I think we're seeing that happening, and that's an interesting development. It's not as national a market as we thought it would be.
Yeah, because it's so hyper localized, does that allow for schools to be more hands-on and involved, or even though it's localized for 90% of players and athletes, is that something the school should kind of keep their distance apart? Because a lot of schools have said that, hey, we can help facilitate or help find NIL deals. We want to break our state laws and all, but because it's so localized, do you see schools potentially getting more involved in the NIL space, or they kind of always keep their distance?
Yeah, there's two major points here. One is obviously, the legal structure that the university finds itself in, right? There's a bunch of different state laws, as we all know. Some states don't have any laws. The NCAA principle is that schools should not be facilitating deals because that easily falls into a recruiting situation. But, right, at this point, the NCAA really hasn't given any guidance. If in fact, people are correct, and I think they are, in saying this is a hyper-local market, then I will believe that schools will start to very soon sort of, inject themselves into that local market. If you look, for example, at what the University of Washington is doing with their Montlake Futures, they're effectively creating a platform that, will include, I believe, all the Husky athletes, men and women, on all the sports, and they can quickly sort of, inform the local marketplace there in Seattle or the greater Seattle area, or Husky alums who are very passionate about the sports programs, where that platform is and how to engage with it. So I do think we're starting to see a number of schools, and particularly at the Power 5 level, that have some resources, who are saying, hey, we can act as a brokerage almost for these local dollars, because I think they're realizing that 90% of NIL opportunities are going to come locally from the local car dealer and the local pizza shop and restaurant and hair salon and gym and you name it. So I think that's a pretty stark realization, at least after these first 4 months.
One of the fascinating parts, you mentioned Power 5 of just college athletics, is things aren't broken down by state, where state laws would kind of hold. They're broken down by conference, right? The Pac-12 spreads across 7 different states as a conference, just by way of example with Washington. And obviously conference discussion comes up a lot with conference realignment happening the last 3 months. We've seen massive changes. How does the conference play a role in NIL long-term? Does conference realignment have any impact, you think, short or long-term, on the NIL discussion? Because now teams are going to be playing different schools, spanning across more states, and with no kind of overall NCAA guidance, these conferences are kind of not sure what their value can really be from an NIL standpoint. So obviously the Power 5 and Group of 5 and all Division I stands out, but just in general, how much can conferences play in the NIL space and help these schools out?
Well, at this point, the conferences, big and small, have played really no role in terms of an NIL. I think that will change, and I think that will change because of the upcoming activity from this constitutional review committee that the NCAA created and is, given sort of its first, guidance, right? So that guidance is to Division I. Division I, take a look at yourself. You've got 350 some schools. You're all over the map in terms of size and athletic budget and sports that they participate in. So there very well could be a further dividing up, if you will, of Division I. The NCAA, because of the Alston Supreme Court decision, really isn't able or willing at this point to have any national parameters for NIL. They've left it up to the states and left it up to the universities in those states where there is no state law. I think eventually the conferences will take some of that authority, some of that power, and create their own model. They can all, even if they're in states where they have different state laws, they obviously can't be more restricted, but they can certainly offer additional things. I could see, like the old NFL quarterback club way back in the 90s that the NFL Players Association had. I could see a conference saying, we're going to take our 12 or 14 or 16 starting quarterbacks and package them with their consent, obviously, and provide some sort of an opportunity, an economic opportunity with NIL. So I think the conferences are going to become more active in this space. They haven't been active at all. So it remains to be seen how active they get. But I think there's some opportunities for the conferences, given the Alston decision and given what I think will be the further divvying up of Division I, based on what the Constitutional Review Committee has sort of sent over to the NCAA as a model for what needs to happen next.
Obviously, you mentioned earlier, teams, every state law differs a little bit, but generally colleges can't create NIL opportunities for athletes directly. They can't facilitate those, and conferences can't either. But the question of recruiting is kind of vague on teams can't use it for recruiting necessarily, but maybe conferences could. Could you see a situation where conferences are using their own NIL policy against each other to say, hey, our conference is better NIL than other conferences? Or do you think there'll be some kind of push for a little more uniformness across every conference?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there certainly is a competitive aspect, right? You take the Power 5 or the Group of 5 or FCS or whatever groupings you want. You would think that there'd be some momentum to have a level playing field, but I think it's possible that a conference could say we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and that X, Y, and Z is going to be much more beneficial in terms of the bottom line to the student athlete. And that's something that's going to be known by that student athlete. Just like you're a high school kid and you're on a recruiting trip and you walk into the weight room and they have all the, best marks of the weightlifters or, athletes, speed, whatever. I think the same thing could easily happen with NIL. How many dollars has the football team generated? How about the starting quarterback or the starting defensive line or whatever it would be? it is a wide open field right now. There hasn't been any guidance of any real substance from the NCAA. And I think schools, as they often do, will continue to push the envelope, and conferences will get involved. So it's certainly, it's certainly conceivable that you might find a couple of conferences who are very aggressive and want to decide we can do more. And, they may very well be in their right, because ultimately this is all, a benefit to student athletes.
So you mentioned recruiting there a little bit, and that's kind of what I want to ask you next. Is the two biggest questions we get from clients is, one, international students, and where's that going to go? We'll kind of leave that one aside for right now because that's still very open-ended. The other one is high school, right? Every state is starting to look at, can high school players receive NIL compensation? What does that look like? And every state's different. And because it's also new, we get questions all the time saying, can we have NIL in this high school area? I guess generally, do you have any sense for what the future could be for high school athletes in the NIL space? Because it's not going to be very many. But again, being that colleges could be hyper localized and there's D3 schools getting NIL opportunities, it's realistic that especially the top high schools in the country could have NIL opportunities based on their state laws. Do you see any kind of trends or what you think might be coming, just at your best guess, as far as high school when it relates to NIL opportunities?
So it's my understanding that there are just two states now, California and New York. And New York just changed their policies a couple, 3 weeks ago. Two states that would allow a student at a public high school, governed by the appropriate secondary school association group, they're now allowed to go out and do NIL deals. They can't use, obviously, the marks of the high school, but they can go out and generate revenue for themselves without jeopardizing their eligibility. And of course, any student could do a deal and not jeopardize his or her college eligibility. But there are still 48 states that don't allow the high school student to monetize his or her ability because they might jeopardize the high school eligibility. So it's pretty nuanced. Ultimately, I think you're right. There are plenty of high schools and plenty of places where high school sports really matter, where they pack 20,000 people, Friday night lights, and, basketball in certain parts of the country, and some of the growing women's sports. So, I think ultimately you'll find that all the states will eventually get to a point where they will allow a student to monetize his or her NIL when he or she is 14 or 15 or 16, involved with high school sports. Same restrictions, right? And you probably need some parental, guidance to do this, right? Because kids are not of the age where they can enter into a contract. But I do think that's coming. And, some people may bemoan it and wish for the good old days. But it's sort of the reality of where we live. And, as I know probably everybody on this webinar, it's entertaining to go to high school games. I mean, if you get two good high school teams playing football or soccer or basketball, it's very, very entertaining. So, and those kids do have a profile in their respective neighborhoods or their respective communities. So I think, this whole sort of concept that's happening at the college level will quickly move down into the high school level. There's already pressure on schools to allow high school NIL because they also don't want to force kids away from public high schools and going into club sports, right? That's the avenue that you can take virtually in every sport, maybe not for football, but virtually every other sport. There's a very robust, very competitive club system. And I don't think we want to drive kids away from their high school team to only play club because then they can monetize themselves.
The rabbit hole goes quickly with high school athletes. You think of Zion Williamson, he could have been a very marketable athlete then. And then you see a funny YouTube video of a youth sports player. Maybe he can get an NIL deal as well too. So the rabbit hole of high school is pretty tough to get a hand on.
There's plenty of sports that are non sort of high school sports in most states, whether it's snowboarding or skateboarding, all the action sports. Some of these, some of the best performers are 15, 16, 17 years old. And, in a sense, they should have the same right that a 19 or 20-year-old college student or a professional athlete at age 25.
So switching gears a little bit and kind of winding down here, and just a couple of questions for you left, Oliver. I appreciate the time. One is, you mentioned about the information early on about we don't have enough information on these NIL deals and opportunities. Is that the biggest area, or is something else still lacking in the NIL market for both athletes and schools to do a good job of understanding market value, of organizing things to make sure players not receiving improper benefits? Is there something still major lacking, or is it just sophistication in the market?
Well, I think there are a number of things that we'll see develop over the next couple of years. I mean, keep in mind this was